All right, my presentation today is called The Flaneur. So I sometimes feel like Matt Frewer, the Max Headroom, trying to get my students to think about how the internet is falling upon us. I'm trying to get them excited about it and think about how it's turning over everything. And so the way I do that is to tell them about 19th century hipsters. The flaneur is a figure who is really important for Baudelaire. Walter Benjamin wrote a book called The Arcades Project, using Baudelaire's idea of the flaneur. The flaneur is a figure who wanders the streets, who enjoys what he or she is seeing, who walks a lobster on the end of a long blue silk ribbon. It is an artist who finds art in the everyday experience. I'm stealing from my co-presenters. And I use the flaneur as a way for students to think about looking at the world in a different way than they do now. We have this vision of students looking at the world in one way, on their phones perhaps, and what I want to do is challenge them to think about how they're going to write and how they're going to explore things using a different perspective. Maybe approach a problem in a different way or explore things in a different way, because this is the premise of the internet. It's making us explore the world. It's making us see the world in different ways. If you search the word flaneur on Flickr, an image searching website, you find all sorts of visions of what it might mean to walk around and look at the world in a different view. And so that's the challenge I give students, to embody the idea of the flaneur. So instead of starting with a research question of knowing what you're going to say when you start, I challenge students to start with a place. And I say, Columbia, we imagine the city as our campus, so we're going to use that. And I tell the students to take a walk and to look at what they see in the city around them, to see the small pieces of art that they find on the walls, to look at the interaction, the detritus of signs from businesses long ago, and to imagine trying to understand what's going on in the city. We use Michel Desserteau's idea of walking the city, the notion that when you walk through a space, you create that space for yourself, and you come to learn the nature of this space based on the use you give it when you explore it. And so I have students take a walk and I tell them, make note of what you see. Write down 15 interesting things. We don't need to know why we're doing that yet, you're just doing that. And then instead of starting with a big pile of research and knowing from the beginning the kinds of things you're going to do, this is the best office from the L train, by the way. Instead of knowing what you're going to do with that research, you're going to start with a starting place and see what you find. So they take those 15 things that they're interested in, and they say, what's one that really intrigued me? Perhaps they've noticed fire escapes for the first time. They've never noticed them before. And they think, why are the fire escapes here? I grew up in a small town, I don't have them all over the place. What's the deal? So they start researching history of fire in Chicago. Maybe they discover the 1903 Iroquois Theater fire, in which 600 people died in a building because some of the fire escapes wouldn't open and some of them were painted doors on the wall. And they start asking, what's the deal with this city where this could happen? And they do this 3 times. They pick out 3 different things from those original 15 that they find interesting, and they dive into them. They pick up a big pile of resources that they're going to use to understand these particular things better, and they still don't know why they're doing it. They don't know where they're going when they're out on this intellectual walk, but they're diving in deep, and the message I'm giving them here is to trust the method. That they, instead of starting with a question and knowing what they're going to say and figuring out a way to say it, they're starting with a process, an exploration, and by trusting that method, they're finding connections between these systems that they hadn't found before. So I'm going to tell 2 quick stories about students who did this. I had one student who took a walk in the Pullman area of Chicago, trying to learn about the parts of Chicago that George Pullman created. And in particular, she was interested in the sort of economic nature of the people living in the Pullman towns. And she became really interested in the Pullman porters, black men who were hired to work in the Pullman sleeping cars and who the passengers would call George because it was convenient, because then they didn't have to learn their actual names, but then they also felt comfortable. Now there's some white men who didn't like the name George being used this way, so they created the Society for the Prevention of Calling Sleeping Car Porters George. Babe Ruth was a member. But so a student was writing about these porters called George, and her Apple computer crashed. And she had AppleCare, so she called the AppleCare helpline, and she got a man with a really thick Indian accent who said, "Hello, my name is Dave, what can I do for you?" And the student had this moment of, this flash of inspiration where she realized that this practice that felt old, this calling of Porter's George was in fact the same thing that Dave was doing when he says his name is Dave, because she's going to feel more comfortable with that name. I had another student who saw the Hull House and became fascinated by it and started researching the history of social good in Chicago. She ran into my wife a couple years later at a conference at DePaul and said that this Hull House assignment had become her life's work. She'd become a social worker, and I gave her a B, apparently. So I have 3 takeaways for us to take with us from these projects. The first is this idea of starting with the stuff first. I'm sorry, Roger, I couldn't get a still from the movie The Stuff about zombies eating marshmallows. Instead, I start with Sherlock Holmes gathering all of the things before he knows what the answer is. Right? So the idea of starting with the things and seeing what emerges from diving into it. It's kind of like writing from the database instead of writing from your answer. It's a very internet-focused exploration. But part of that is trusting your own artistic sense, your creative intuition to drive how you're going to explore that. It's sort of like a kind of improvisational readiness that one would find in a blues class, right? That you learn to navigate. You know the way that you're going to get there, but you don't know where you're going. And finally, I use the flaneur method to kind of prompt a kind of curiosity in my students that's designed around the idea of growing in the way that you're going to explore things and understanding that you might not know where you're going, but you're going to love the process of trying to get there. Thank you.